Welcome back everyone, this is History with Hilbert here, and today you're watching a video about Cardinal Wolsey. Now Cardinal Wolsey was born in the early 1470s, and what made him special was that he was of common stock. Now his father is often described as being a butcher, and therefore he is a commoner, which is unusual for the period. Now the only way that commoners could sort of rise in the social hierarchy during this time was through the church, and this is exactly what Thomas Wolsey does. Now his route to learning went through, I think he went to Ipswich school, where he was born in Ipswich, and then he went on to Magdalen College at Oxford. And after that he was ordained as a priest, because as I said, that's the only way you used to be able to rise up through the ranks of society in the medieval, in the Tudor period. Now in 1502 he became the chaplain to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And in 1507, he started working for Henry VII, who, we all know Henry VII if you've been watching my channel, the original OG. He started working for Henry VII in 1507 as the royal chaplain, so he really does very quickly become quite an important figure in the country. And you can tell he was an important figure and respected by Henry VII, because he was sent to Scotland on a diplomatic mission after the Scots were trying to reform the old alliance with the French. Now unfortunately Henry VII isn't alive for much longer, and he's given a seat on the Privy Council under Henry VIII. Now Henry VIII wanted to go to war, but most of his councillors didn't. Now, Wolsey didn't want to go to war at first. However, he realised that if he was the only councillor saying, let's go to war, then the king is much more likely to promote him, because King Henry at this stage was a young man. He wanted to be more of a warrior king. Whereas the councillors who he had, I think Fox is one of them, Richard Fox, he was inherited from his father, from Henry VII, and if you've watched a few of my videos on Henry VII, you'll know that foreign policy-wise, he's very careful, very cautious. He was very much looking at all the documents himself, making sure everything was in order, much more like Wolsey. Wolsey was a bit more like Henry VII. He very much enjoyed looking at documents and going through things that other rulers would find tedious. Henry VIII is the opposite. He's a young man. He wants to go to war, he wants to make a name for himself, and to sort of bring England onto the world stage, which was very much sort of the opposite of what Henry VII did. So Wolsey realises this, and Wolsey says, let's go to war, and he gives lots of speeches in the Privy Council to persuade the other councillors to join him in war. And in 1515, Wolsey becomes the Lord Chancellor. I think he replaces the Archbishop of Canterbury, Sir William Warham. So Wolsey immediately sets out to do what Henry wants him to do, and to aid him as best as possible. Now before I go on, I'm going to have a quick look at what was going on in Europe at the time, because some of Wolsey's best achievements were in the realm of foreign policy. And if we look at Europe at the time, we'll start with England. England was a fairly insignificant player on the European stage at the time. The Tudor dynasty, had been started by Henry VIII's dad, by Henry VII, got plenty of videos about him, and the dynasty was still fairly weak. Now to the north, Scotland was a fully independent nation at the time, and the Scots were enemies of the English. So the Scots were also allies of the French, who were also traditionally the enemies of the English, and this alliance was called the Old Alliance. And this was a constant headache for the English kings, because then you've got the possibility of a Scottish invasion from the north, drawing away English troops to fight that off, while the French would then land troops on the south coast of England in another place, so you'd have to divert your armies. And this happened several times during this period, so this definitely wasn't unfounded. Now at the same time, you had the Habsburg powers of the Holy Roman Empire, and in Spain as well. Spain was also a fairly new country, a fairly new unified country, but it was also on the rise, but less so as France. Now Spain had been united before in the 1490s, I think, by Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the king and queen of Castile and Castile and Leon and Aragon, I think. Never mind, they were important Spanish kingdoms. And the Habsburg Netherlands were also a power around, who were linked to the two, and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire actually amalgamated into essentially amalgamated into one kingdom or empire or confederacy under Charles V, who during this period became both the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor. Now the French, as I said, were on the rise during this period. Their power was increasing. And where this essentially played out was in Italy. You had the Italian Wars, you had the Wars of the League of Cambrai, you had the Wars of the League of Cognac, you had the many Italian wars which played out in Italy. Now Italy wasn't unified at this time. There were lots of little Italian states. You had Genoa, Florence, Venice. They all switched sides many times. And that's essentially where the French did battle with the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope. Now, at the same time, you had in Eastern Europe, in the Balkan and some of the Slavic countries, the Ottoman Empire was the big power. They'd invaded Europe. They were this Islamic kingdom, or an Islamic empire, who had much of North Africa under their control, large parts of the Middle East, and they had invaded this part of Europe, and they actually tried to push into Western Europe. Now, the first Islamic attempts at conquest of Europe were from the Moors from Spain, but they were defeated already in, I think, the 8th century by the Franks, by, I think, Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers, and they'd been pushed back. But now they were coming in from the other side, from the east, through the Ottoman Empire, and obviously this was a big worry for the Pope, who was the papacy, the traditional enemy of Islam, because they were the upholders of Christendom. So while all the European nations were fighting each other, the Pope was going, guys, the Ottomans, you might want to sort them out. Now obviously they did get sorted out. I think the siege of Vienna in 1540, I don't know, somewhere you had the siege of Vienna, and after that they ceased to become a power and go in a sort of a long period of stagnation, I believe, also with the Venetian fleet starting to rout Ottoman fleets. But that's definitely time for another video, and I definitely need to do more research in that. But essentially what we need to know for this one is that everyone was basically ganging up on the French, and apart from the Scottish, because they had a vested interest in being the ally to their enemy's enemy, i.e. the French. As a part of the League of Cambrai and in this sort of general anti-French coalition, the English under Henry VIII, they invade Gascony, which is a region in, I think it's the southwest of France. It was called Aquitaine, and it used to belong to England during the 100 Years' War and a little bit before, but the French basically took back all the English possessions in France, apart from, I think, Calais remained in English territory in France in sort of the latter half of the 15th century, while the English were busy fighting each other in the Wars of the Roses. Now, Henry VIII's army doesn't do very well, and they are being pushed back in 1512. However, in 1513, Cardinal Wolsey takes over. Now, he's very good at organising things, and he ensures that the English army is supplied and organised throughout the campaign, and the English actually managed to do quite well. In 1513 as well, you've got the Battle of the Spurs, which was a battle in which Henry VIII himself took part. Now, it sounds very glorious, and in that Henry VIII led the charge himself and routed the French. But there were 30,000 Anglo-Imperial troops, the Spanish under King... was it King Ferdinand? No, it mustn't have been. It must have been the... Imperial troops from the Holy Roman Empire. In the English, they had about 30,000 troops. The French had about 7,000, and they managed to surprise the French. And it really wasn't that much of a significant battle, but it was a big morale booster, and it filled Henry's ego significantly that Wolsey went up in his good books. So it was all good for Wolsey. Now, in 1514, the very creatively named Anglo-French Treaty of 1514 was signed, and this was between the English and the French, sort of off the back of the Battle of the Spurs, of winning that battle. And it said that Princess Mary, who was Henry's sister, would marry the King of the French, so King Louis. As well, the city of Tournai, which had been besieged by the English, was allowed to remain in English hands, and the French would essentially pay the English more money. And this was worked up by Cardinal Wolsey again, so it's another success of his in the realm of foreign policy. Now, in 1518, Wolsey is made the papal legate to England by the Pope. And as I was saying before, the Pope really didn't like the fact that the European nations were fighting each other while the Ottomans were slowly becoming more powerful, while they were slowly marching westwards potentially towards Rome. That would be the biggest nightmare of all for the Christians, was if Rome itself would fall to, the Muslims. That's unthinkable when a few centuries before they were the ones who were in control of the Holy Land of Jerusalem. So what Wolsey does is he holds a summit between all the largest powers in Europe. Now, all the nations of Europe were invited, and most of them did show up. So you've got things like the Holy Roman Empire, the French, you've got the Burgundian, I'm not sure if they were around still. We'll have to check that one. You've got the Habsburg Netherlands, you've got Spain, you've got the Papal States, you've got England, of course. All of the big powers were there. And essentially it's just a big anti-war coalition. So if you think of sort of stop the war kind of thing that you might have today, a big protest march, it's kind of like that, but then the Renaissance version with Cardinal Wolsey there. And essentially they all promise that they aren't going to attack each other, and that they have a non-aggression pact, and that instead they are then going to fight against the rising power of the Ottomans in the Balkan, which is why the Pope wanted them to do this in the first place. So that's all well and good. Now, another of his great achievements was the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520. And what this was essentially a massive, how to describe it best, maybe as a huge fun fair, maybe, that kind of thing, very lavish, to show off the wealth of the English. And it was held in, I think, the county of Calais in northern France, Calais was then an English garrison city in northern France on the other side of the English Channel. And it was essentially a meeting between the English king, Henry VIII, and the French king, I think, was it Francis already? I think Francis I of France. And they essentially met, and this was again to back up the Anglo-French treaty, which was signed in 1514, to ensure good relations between the two kings, and essentially to show off English wealth. And this was all organised by Cardinal Wolsey again, and it was very much a success. However, the nations of Europe would soon be busy fighting each other once again, the Ottomans forgotten, so that they can, let off some steam, I imagine. Now, in 1525, the Battle of Pavia was fought, and this was a very decisive battle. It was fought between the Imperial Army, so of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Spanish, against the French. And the French were defeated in what can only be described as a decisive shrekking. Now, this actually led to the end of a whole war. Very large numbers of soldiers involved, and I think something like 15,000 Frenchmen fell on the day, with only a few hundred casualties on the imperial side. And what's more, the French King Francis was captured by the Holy Roman Empire. Now, this had huge consequences, not only for the nations involved in the actual battle. Fun fact, Richard de la Pole died in that battle. He was younger brother to Edmund de la Pole. They had been Yorkist rebels and potential claimants to the throne, so that's another by the by. I think I mentioned that one in one of my Henry VII videos. But for Henry VIII as well, Henry VIII now sees this as his chance to reclaim the lands in France lost to the French, which used to be English. And this claim went right back to Henry VI, to Henry V, who'd invaded areas. Then you've got Edward III, the Black Prince. It goes right the way back to probably to William the Conqueror. And this claim was still being pressed, at least 500 years later. Now, all Henry needed to do was to raise the funds to invade France, because the King of France had been taken prisoner. The French army had had a massive, shrekking, as I called it, at the Battle of Pavia. So the road essentially lay open to the English dominating France. There was no powerful figurehead, and the army was in tatters. All they needed now was money, and Parliament said no. And you can imagine how annoyed Henry would have been at that. So Henry, as he always does in this era, he asks Wolsey to sort it out for him. So what Wolsey does is he essentially levies this tax called the amicable grant. And the amicable grant was a benevolence. And a benevolence was essentially forcing people to pay you money and saying you're doing it from the good of your own heart because you are loyal to your king. Obviously, people are not very happy, and people were very annoyed about the amicable grant. It essentially entailed that a sixth to a tenth of a layperson's goods were taken, and a third of the clergy's goods were taken to fund the war effort. And this the reception was awful. There were huge riots and unhappiness, and this almost broke out into absolute rebellion. Now, for Henry VII as well, taxation for wars had caused rebellion in Yorkshire, in Cornwall several times, and it's no different for Henry VIII. And actually, Cardinal Wolsey has to completely back down because there is the threat of there being a complete national rebellion against these taxes for the amicable grant. And this means that he has failed Henry, and Henry is none too happy about this at all, and this is one of the reasons why Wolsey fell from grace. In the meantime, the French are back on their feet. They've got an interim government under Louise of Savoy, and then Cardinal Wolsey has to sign a treaty with them called the Treaty of the Moor, which essentially said the English would give up some of the claims on the French territory in exchange for the French paying the rest of the dowry price of Queen Mary, who'd been married to King Louis of France, but Louis had died very soon after, and now their new King Francis was imprisoned by the Holy Roman Empire, and the English promised that they would then try and secure the release of Francis, who was, as I said, in imperial captivity. Now, some of the other things that Cardinal Wolsey did during his period that weren't related to foreign policy, so domestic policy, was to reform the system of taxation. Now, the old system of taxation had been that essentially the exact same sum would be taken from essentially a very poor person as, say, a minister or someone else very high up. So essentially they would lose the same amount of money, but of course to a poor person that could be half of their annual income, and for a minister on the council that would be, say, maybe a 20th of their annual income. So it was the disparity was very large. But what Cardinal Wolsey did was he made it more proportional in a sense. So it would be proportional to, say, how much they earned. Now, Cardinal Wolsey did a lot to help the poor people at the time. And this was another reason why so many nobles really did not like Cardinal Wolsey, because he stood up for the poor. Now, because remember, Cardinal Wolsey himself was a commoner, which was very unusual at the time to have commoners rising through the ranks. Henry VII did this as well with the councillors learned in law, with Empson and Dudley. They too were both from lower backgrounds, which was very unheard of in this time, as I said. Now, he also started the Court of the Star Chamber, and what the Court of the Star Chamber was, and the Court of the Chancery, they were to deal with more high-profile cases, as well as so that common people could bring their grievances to court and get a fair hearing. Now, it was very efficient in doing this, and this is obviously a much more fair system than before, where essentially if you had a grievance and you're a poor person, get on with it, because you're not poor enough, you're not going to be able to pay for having a lawyer and having representation, and if it's against some rich folks, then they can just pay off the judge, bribe them. But this was a lot more fair. However, it was very much abused, and so many poor people came to court with issues, because they obviously had a lot of issues, that it was just so overloaded that it couldn't function properly. Now, as well, he actually dissolved some monasteries, and this is in part due to the Reformation. Now, obviously, he was Catholic, he's a cardinal. Most of England was Catholic at this time. Henry was still Catholic at this time, although that would change soon. And he actually dissolved some of the monasteries, and he sent his secretary in the later years of his life, Thomas Cromwell, who would later also dissolve monasteries under Henry VIII, but I'll get onto that later. And he did this because he thought that they were too corrupt, these monasteries, which is quite surprising, because if anyone was corrupt, then it was Cardinal Wolsey himself. He really profited very much from the church. He had lots of estates, lots of wealth, which is then another reason why he was very much hated by many people, because he was seen as this corrupt figure and a commoner, to make it even worse. Now, Cardinal Wolsey's real downfall comes when Henry VIII is looking to get rid of his lawfully wedded wife, Catherine of Aragon. Now, they'd married very young, they'd married for love, and they had a genuinely happy marriage. However, Catherine of Aragon hadn't been able to produce a male heir. She'd had a daughter called Mary, who would later become the famous Bloody Mary, but no son, and this was a big issue for Henry VIII, no pun intended. Now, Henry VIII was actually already in love with another woman, with Anne Boleyn, who was one of the courtiers, she was one of the courtiers. She'd been brought up at a French court, and he was very much charmed by her. And what he needed was a male heir, and he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, but of course he was already married to Catherine of Aragon. So what they had to do back in the days before the Reformation and before the Reformation of Catholicism was to get a divorce, you had to get an annulment. And to get an annulment, you had to go straight to the Pope, Christ's vicar on earth. So Henry has to go to the Pope to get an annulment for his marriage to Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn. And this is where Wolsey's downfall comes in. Because Henry then obviously asks Wolsey to do this for him. Wolsey has sorted everything out for him in the past. However, the situation's complicated. The Pope, who was Clement at the time, might have wanted to give Henry an annulment, but he had been captured by imperial forces when they had sacked Rome. Charles V was the King of Spain, as well as the Holy Roman Emperor, and his niece was Catherine of Aragon. So of course, he, who is essentially controlling the Pope, doesn't want Henry to have the annulment granted, which would then see his niece being divorced from power. So this complicates the situation very much, and essentially means that Cardinal Wolsey has no way of granting the annulment. Now, Anne Boleyn then really doesn't like Cardinal Wolsey either, and she essentially persuades Henry that it's Wolsey's fault that the annulment hasn't gone ahead. And Henry then has him arrested and has all of his titles stripped, apart from the Archbishop of York. Now, he then returns to York, Cardinal Wolsey, because that's the only position he's got left, but then he's recalled to London on treason charges, and the charges he's called on are the charges of praemunire, and praemunire was essentially where it's believed that you were putting your religion or the Pope before the king of the land. And this is very much a Reformation idea, and at the time Henry was flirting with Protestantism. I think Anne Boleyn was a convinced Protestant, and he was obviously, looking to marry her. And this was as well when Henry was thinking, well, if I can't get a divorce through the church, then I might make my own church. What was the alternative to Catholicism starting up in northern Germany? Well, that would be Protestantism. So this charge of praemunire is put against Cardinal Wolsey, and he's recalled to London. So he goes back from York down to London, but on the road in Leicester he falls severely ill, and Cardinal Wolsey dies in 1530 in Leicester on the road to London. And that's the end of the saga, essentially, of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Now, Wolsey's secretary, actually, Thomas Cromwell, would soon replace him as Henry's chief advisor upon his death. And it's under Thomas Cromwell that the English Reformation goes through. It's under Thomas Cromwell that the annulment of the marriage to Catherine of Aragon happens. And he's the guy who's in charge of the dissolution of the monasteries. So in episode 2 of what I think will be a series, I will look into Thomas Cromwell at the rise and fall of him and what he got up to. Now, I'd just like to read a little bit before ending this video from a very good book by Ronald Hutton called A Brief History of Britain 1485 to 1660, because I think it's quite an interesting dynamic, and I'd like to leave you with this. So, one final reflection may help to set Wolsey in perspective. In the early 15th century, England was also ruled on behalf of a young king called Henry by a brilliant, hard-working, arrogant, greedy and sensual man who was both a cardinal and a royal minister. This was Cardinal Beaufort, yet he has always been remembered with general admiration as a great statesman. Could it be that Beaufort was lucky enough to live in a less demanding age, with no Reformation swelling up behind him? Or could it be that he was a member of the royal family, and so everybody expected him to lead and to show off? It may be worth wondering how much of the traditional animosity towards Wolsey has been bound up with the English class system. Alright everyone, so this has been my video on Cardinal Wolsey and the rise and fall. Now I hope you have enjoyed this video. It's been a little bit rambly, but I guess that's okay. I swear I say this at the end of every video. So if you'd like to know anything else, then please do leave a comment in the comment section below. I think I will make another video like this about Thomas Cromwell, and perhaps some more videos about this era. Now I am going to return to Henry VII at some point as well, because I honestly prefer Henry VII to Henry VIII, as well as some other topics, so some more historical discussions, maybe some more stuff about South Africa, Vikings, of course, Anglo-Saxons, some of the Celtic nations, that kind of thing. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, and if you're not already, then don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed. If you want to know anything else or want to leave anything behind, then pop a comment, and I will see you in the next one.